Another week of NFL football is now in the books, and you know what that means. It's time for another Sports Ball Network's NFL Weekly Breakdown. Kicking things off in Philadelphia, the Eagles ran their way to a 34-28 victory over the Minnesota Vikings. If you're an Eagles fan, you have to be happy about 2-0. However, you have to be a little bit concerned about the passing offense. Jalen Hurts does look like he's regressed a little bit, particularly with his footwork. Something to monitor here, but overall, the Eagles are still the class of the NFC for now. Meanwhile, in Minnesota, it seems like this season's going a similar direction as last season was. Great offense, terrible defense. What's more is that quarterback Kirk Cousins is putting up MVP level statistics through these first two games. He's thrown for over 700 yards and 6 touchdowns, only 1 interception. If Minnesota has a chance to make the playoffs after no 1-2 start, it's going to be because Kirk Cousins is bailing them out with his arm. On Sunday, there were a number of exciting 1 p.m. games, including the Falcons and the Packers, who had a duel down in Atlanta. Falcons ended up taking the win, winning 25-24, led mostly by Desmond Ridder in a fourth quarter comeback. And at first, the young quarterback did not look very good in this game. In this game, he had his first interception as a professional, and honestly, he had a couple throws that probably should have been interceptions as well. Granted, the whole Falcons offense looked kind of skittish in the first half of this game, but what matters here is the second half, where Desmond Ridder and the Falcons offense as a whole looked much better and managed a fourth quarter comeback. Things are quite encouraging for Atlanta. And honestly, if Desmond Ridder can keep up this play, he could end up being a long-term option at quarterback. Meanwhile, the Packers, 1-1 after 2 games, have to be encouraged by the play of quarterback Jordan Love. He's looked really good through these first 2 games, and honestly, he could also be the answer for their franchise as well. And quick aside, if you're a Bears fan, you have to be extremely upset by this development. Some teams just get so lucky with quarterbacks, and it appears that the Green Bay Packers might be one of them. First, they've had Brett Favre, then they had Aaron Rodgers, and now Jordan Love is not looking nearly as bad as people thought he would be. And on that note, let's talk Bears Bucks. Starting with the Buccaneers, who won 27-17. They look much better than everyone thought they would be. Baker Mayfield, who was widely criticized for much of the offseason, actually looks quite competent. And the passing offense of Tampa Bay has looked quite good. In particular, Mike Evans stood out this week with 6 receptions for 171 yards and a touchdown. If you're a Bears fan, on the other hand, you have to be quite concerned about the development of quarterback Justin Fields. For much of last season, Justin Fields did not look like a very polished passer, and the Chicago offense struggled. And so far, at least through these 2 games, that trend seems to be continuing. And it's not as if Chicago doesn't have any receiving options at this point either. DJ Moore had 6 receptions for 104 yards, and Cole Kmet is one of the better young tight ends in the league. At this point, people are really starting to question if Justin Fields is the answer in Chicago. With the Kansas City Chiefs up next, things might not get rosier for a while. Moving on to the Kansas City Chiefs-Jacksonville Jaguars game, fans finally got to see Travis Kelce play this season. And at first, much like last week, the Kansas City Chiefs, and in particular the passing offense, struggled. It took a while for Patrick Mahomes and Travis Kelce to get going here. Once they did in the second half, it became obvious that the Kansas City Chiefs were going to win the game, especially considering Trevor Lawrence and the Jacksonville Jaguars were not exactly playing very well either. Lawrence struggled on the day, going 22 for 41 for only 216 yards. He also took 4 sacks, including a critical one that ended up stealing the game. However, I don't expect the Jaguars to continue to struggle. With the level of talent on this roster, and considering they play the Texans next week, I fully expect Jacksonville to bounce back. Down in Houston, there was a rookie quarterback battle today, as second overall pick C.J. Stroud dueled fourth overall pick Anthony Richardson. And at least through the first quarter, it was Anthony Richardson that looked really, really good, as he ran for 2 touchdowns and was overall distributing the ball quite well as a passer. Really, Anthony Richardson has looked quite good over these first two games, and full credit goes to Shane Steichen and the Colts coaching staff. However, what's not as good is the complete and utter disregard Anthony Richardson has for his health. He took multiple big hits and ended up leaving the game with a concussion. He's got to learn how to protect himself if he wants to stay in the league. But overall, Colts fans have to be encouraged by what they're seeing. Houston Texan fans also have to be encouraged by what they're seeing out of their rookie quarterback as well. The Texans let CJ Stroud air it out, and he responded quite well, throwing for 384 yards and 2 touchdowns. Of course, Texans fans have to be less encouraged by the performance of their offensive line, which gave up 6 sacks and did not give running back Dameon Pierce enough room to get anything going. But still, overall, though, with young standouts on offense, Dameon Pierce, Nico Collins, Tank Dell, and quarterback CJ Stroud, and some intriguing talent on defense, including Derek Stingley Jr., as well as third overall pick Will Anderson, things are looking up in Houston. After a relatively poor performance in the opener last week, Bills quarterback Josh Allen responded quite well, only throwing 6 incompletions en route to a 274-yard passing day to go along with 3 touchdowns. The Bills look fine, guys, and they're going to be a contender. That much is obvious. What's also obvious is that the Raiders may struggle a little bit this year. What's concerning, though, in particular, is that the Vegas rushing attack only got 55 yards, and star running back Josh Jacobs ran for -2 yards on the ground. And at this point, with the offense in Vegas struggling as much as it is, you have to wonder if Coach McDaniels is firmly on the hot seat right now. Fans in Detroit were treated to a thrilling home opener, which ended up in an overtime shootout between the Seattle Seahawks and the Detroit Lions. However, it was not the home team Detroit Lions who were favored to win that ended up pulling away. It was instead the Seattle Seahawks who grinded out a 37-31 win. And for Seattle, it has to be really encouraging to get this win in the season. Starting 0-2 in what's appearing to be a really tough NFC West would not have been ideal. And the fact that Geno and the Seahawks were able to put this one away is big for them. Meanwhile, the Lions showed that they weren't a fluke and that their performance against Kansas City was more of a harbinger of what's to come rather than the exception. Jared Goff and the Lions offense overall looked really good again, and the Lions defense, although it didn't do enough this time, was consistently putting pressure on Geno Smith and the Seahawks offense all game long. If I'm a Detroit Lions fan, although I'm upset by the loss, I'd overall be very, very encouraged by this team, and especially be encouraged by their prospects to win the division this year. Keeping things up north, there was a divisional clash between the Cincinnati Bengals and the Baltimore Ravens, which the Ravens ended up winning 27-24. If you're the Cincinnati Bengals, you have to be worried about this 0-2 start. Joe Burrow does not look particularly elite right now, and honestly, given how tough your division is, an uphill climb to the playoffs is not something you want to face. Meanwhile, Baltimore's offense, particularly their rushing offense, kept on humming despite the loss of J.K. Dobbins. Gus Edwards took 10 carries and converted it into 62 yards and a touchdown. Lamar Jackson was running all over the place. And Justice Hill also looked relatively comfortable in the offense. But what's more encouraging as a Baltimore fan is the passing offense. Receivers such as Zay Flowers and Nelson Aguilar had standout performances this week. And with Mark Andrews back, the passing offense looked to have a balanced attack. If Baltimore can keep this up, I don't see why they're not the favorites in the AFC North. There was a second overtime game this week during the 1 p.m. slate of games between the Chargers and the Titans, who ended up prevailing 27-24. This game flew under the radar, but it was quite telling to see the Chargers choke another lead away after halftime. And really, what Austin Ekeler says is true. This team can't finish, and they're really, really inconsistent at the absolute worst times. Meanwhile, for Titans fans and for the Titans, it was good to get a win here and move to 1-1. Ryan Tannehill looked much better than he did last week, only throwing 4 incompletions in this game and having a clean slate with no interceptions or turnovers. Derrick Henry did his usual thing, and the Titans defense did just enough to get the win. However, I want to take it back to the Chargers for a second. Justin Herbert had another standout performance, throwing for 305 yards and 2 touchdowns. And I have to think that Coach Brandon Staley is on the hot seat or very close to getting fired. I mean, the team lost that wild card game after being up 28-0. They've started 0-2 now. They choked away this lead and they ended up losing in overtime. This team under Brandon Staley clearly does not have that X factor, and they cannot win these tight games for whatever reason. If the Chargers keep on losing these close games, or really if they just keep on losing, one has to wonder how much longer Staley keeps on that headset. Moving on to the 4 p.m. slate of games, we start with the 49ers and the Rams. Now, although the Rams lost this game 23-30, the fans of the team have to be encouraged by the development of young players on offense, including Kyren Williams, Puka Nacua, and Tutu Atwell. In particular, fans have to be thrilled with the performance of Nacua, who had 20 targets on the day. In fact, he's put up a rookie record and has gotten an absurd 25 catches through the first 2 games of his career. Have the Rams found another Cooper Kupp? I think they might have. Meanwhile, the San Francisco 49ers continue to do their thing, and Brock Purdy played clean, turnover-free football. Today, it was Deebo Samuel who got it done for the team, having 38 rushing yards and a touchdown on the ground to go along with 63 receptions. And of course, Christian McCaffrey was also a major factor as well. But overall, looking at the San Francisco 49ers team, it's clear that any one of their playmakers, Deebo, Ayuk, Kittle, McCaffrey, would break out any one single week and help carry the team to victory. The San Francisco defense also did its part as well, picking off quarterback Matthew Stafford 2 times. Gotta say, the 49ers look really, really good so far. And although things might appear to be tougher in the NFC overall, one can't help but think that they're also one of the favorites to come out of the conference. Speaking of teams likely to come out of the NFC, the favorite at this point has to be the Dallas Cowboys, who routed the New York Jets 30-10 at home. The Dallas defense has been on an absolutely historic tear so far and has held their opponents through 2 games to only 10 points. The defense had 3 interceptions against quarterback Zach Wilson and nearly returned 2 of them for touchdowns. They also had 3 sacks and a forced fumble. This team looks really, really good, and I would be scared to play them at the level that they're playing right now. Meanwhile, for the New York Jets, one has to wonder why they only ran the ball 16 times throughout the whole game. And really, when you think about it, they only ran the ball 11 times. 5 of those carries were Zach Wilson running for his life. Speaking of Zach Wilson, one can't help but feel bad for him. He only completed 12 out of his 27 attempts and threw 3 interceptions. He really wasn't supposed to start this season, and if the Aaron Rodgers injury hadn't happened, he would have had a real chance to develop behind one of the greats. But now he's being thrust into the fire, and so far he's floundering. If the Jets want any sort of chance to compete for the playoffs or to win any sort of game this year, they're going to need to take the ball out of Zach's hands and put it right into Breece Hall's. The other New York team also had a game this week during the afternoon, as the New York Giants took on the Arizona Cardinals and ended up mounting a big fourth quarter comeback to win 31-28. Through the first 6 quarters of the season, it really looked like the New York Giants were perhaps the absolute worst team in football. In fact, through those first 6 quarters, the Giants were outscored by their opponents 60-0. But they did end up rallying and taking the win against the Cardinals and might have saved their season as a result. Unless, of course, Saquon Barkley, who was hurt on the second to last play of the game, ends up missing any extended time with his sprained ankle, an injury that he got on the second to last play of the game. So far, it's been confirmed that he's going to be out against the 49ers on Thursday, but he could come back the week after, and right now he's considered week to week. Meanwhile, looking at the Arizona Cardinals, you have to applaud them for their effort. Many people, myself included, thought the Cardinals were going to be absolutely terrible this year. Through their first two games, they've shown that if they're given a chance, they'll end up fighting until the very end. If Kyler Murray comes back early enough and plays at a decent enough level, this team could make some serious noise come December. However, if he doesn't come back, or if he plays at a very poor level, they'd be looking at drafting Caleb Williams. Either way, the outcome may not be as bad for Cardinals fans as it once appeared to be. Moving on to our final game of the 4 p.m. slate, we have the Denver Broncos and the Washington Commanders. And for the most part, this game was pretty boring through the first three quarters. However, the fourth quarter had a lot of excitement as the Commanders rallied back from a deficit to take the lead with less than a minute to go. So, what ended up happening?
Wilson looking for a miracle. Gonna gather, unleashes towards the end zone. It is deflected in the air, and it's caught. Brandon Johnson.
You saw that right. The Broncos actually converted on a Hail Mary touchdown. Of course, they would then fail to get the 2-point conversion, but still, this game actually ended up being quite exciting considering the teams playing. And so far, you have to give credit to Washington. They're 2-0, and quarterback Sam Howell has played relatively well. But really, the team is succeeding on the back of Brian Robinson, who had an absolutely monster day, rushing for 87 yards and 2 touchdowns, as well as hauling in 42 receiving yards. Meanwhile, the Broncos are now 0-2 to start the Sean Payton era, and there's a lot of doubt being cast upon this team. They absolutely need to win next week. If they don't, things could start to get ugly very quickly up in the Mile High City. Sunday night saw a divisional clash between AFC East rivals in Miami and New England, and this game was relatively boring, which is the type of game I would absolutely expect from these two teams. Bill Belichick basically forced Miami to abandon their high-octane passing offense and instead try to beat his team on the ground. And for the first three quarters, the Miami Dolphins were doing just that. However, in the fourth quarter, New England, much like they did last week, began to mount a comeback. And unfortunately for them, much like last week, things came up just a bit short, and they fell 24-17. For Miami, they showed that they were able to win a game in a different way than what they're used to, which is very encouraging for them in the future. Tua played relatively well again, and as long as he remains healthy, this team should be able to compete. Meanwhile, for New England, one thing was made abundantly clear. Although Mac Jones might not be the clear-cut answer, he has looked better, and giving him a real offensive coordinator was the right thing to do. As he continues to grow in this offense, and as the Patriots defense and Bill Belichick continue to come up with amazing game plans to stifle their opponents, don't be surprised if New England remains in the playoff hunt and steals quite a few games away that people weren't expecting them to win. Wrapping up week 2, we had a Monday night doubleheader, kicked off with the game against the Saints and the Panthers. The Saints ended up taking this one 20-17, and that was mostly on the back of their defense. For much of the night, the New Orleans offense remained relatively inconsistent, and an injury to Jamal Williams meant that the running game could never really get going. On the other side, the Carolina Panthers offense also remained relatively inconsistent, and quarterback Bryce Young, in his second NFL start, looked very much like a rookie. However, there were some encouraging signs at the end of the game, as he was able to put together a pretty nice 2-minute drill. The final game of this week saw the Cleveland Browns take on the Pittsburgh Steelers, and this game ended up in a 26-22 Pittsburgh win. The big story out of this game, unfortunately, though, is the injury to running back Nick Chubb. Hopefully, he'll recover soon. But from a football perspective, the Cleveland Browns defense once again showed why it's one of the better units in the league. And the Cleveland offense had an encouraging performance. For Pittsburgh, this win, though, was sorely needed. They needed to bounce back in a big way after their loss against San Francisco. And Kenny Pickett, although inconsistent for much of the night, was able to guide the offense to do just enough in order to secure the win. Thanks again for watching the Sports Ball Network's NFL Week 2 breakdown, and we'll see you again in Week 3.